On the night of August 14, 1945, a small group of Japanese army officers murdered their own general, forged an imperial military order using his dead body's stamp, and seized the Tokyo Imperial Palace, all to stop a 4-minute, 45-second audio recording from reaching the airwaves. None of it worked. For several hours, though, the end of World War II came down to whether a handful of rebels could locate a set of gramophone discs hidden somewhere inside a blacked-out imperial palace. This is the story of Japan's last 24 hours before surrender, the war council that deadlocked, the emperor's decision that broke it, the coup that tried to undo everything, and the Chamberlain who hid the recording that ended the war. To understand what drove a group of officers to commit treason, murder, and suicide to stop a radio broadcast, you need to understand what Japan actually looked like in the summer of 1945. By late July of that year, the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer conduct major operations. 64 Japanese cities had been burned or bombed out of function. The single most destructive conventional air raid ever carried out struck Tokyo on the night of March 9 into March 10, 1945, a night that killed between 83,000 and 97,000 people, depending on the record consulted. The Tokyo Fire Department counted 97,000 dead. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department documented 83,793 killed, 40,918 wounded, and 286,358 buildings destroyed in one night. The physical country was being erased city by city, and Japan's military leadership knew it. None of that stopped the propaganda campaign, which had a name: the glorious death of 100 million. The slogan carried one message: the entire population of Japan should die before surrendering. That was the world inside which 6 men sat around a table and tried to decide whether to end the war, and could not reach an agreement. Japan's wartime government ran through a body called the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, and in August 1945 that body came down to 6 men whose decisions required complete unanimity. That single structural rule would nearly keep the war going indefinitely. The 6: Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, War Minister Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yanai, Army Chief of Staff Yashijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Somu Toyota. Suzuki, Togo, and Yanai formed the Peace Party. All three wanted to accept the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied ultimatum issued on July 26, 1945, demanding the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, but on one condition: preservation of the emperor and the imperial system, what the Japanese called kokutai. Across the table sat Anami, Umezu, and Toyota, demanding 4 conditions. Preservation of kokutai, yes, but also Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials, Japan would disarm its own forces without Allied involvement, and no Allied forces would occupy the Japanese home islands. 3-3. Perfect deadlock. The Potsdam Declaration's wording was at the center of the dispute, and the document had an omission that mattered enormously. Issued by the United States, the United Kingdom, and China, the Soviet Union was not yet at war with Japan. The declaration promised Japan would not be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation. But it said nothing specific about the emperor's fate. Every man around that table understood the silence, and none of them trusted it. And that's when a single Japanese word made everything worse. When Prime Minister Suzuki was asked at a press conference about the declaration, he used the word mokusatsu, a term that carries meanings ranging from ignore to refrain from comment, depending on context. The international press translated it as rejection. By the time Tokyo's leadership grasped the error, Washington was already reading it as Japan's definitive answer. The ambiguity of a single word helped set the final weeks of the deadliest conflict in human history. Modern diplomatic translation services use what linguists call pragmatic disambiguation, formal protocols designed specifically to flag words carrying multiple contextual meanings before a statement goes public. International relations scholars still cite the Potsdam Mokusatsu incident as the foundational example of why translation precision is not a bureaucratic nicety. It is a function that determines whether wars continue. While the Big Six sat deadlocked, external pressure was closing in from two directions at once, and historians have argued for 80 years about which one mattered more. August 6, 1945, at approximately 8:15 in the morning, a B-29 called the Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb named Little Boy over Hiroshima, detonating at roughly 1,900 feet above the city. Between 90,000 and 166,000 people died by the end of 1945. The range is that wide because the city's records were destroyed along with everything else. Hiroshima's population at the time sat between 280,000 and 350,000 people, with a military garrison adding between 24,000 and 43,000 more. Approximately 90% of the dead were civilians. 3 days later, August 9th, at 10:58 in the morning, a B-29 named Boxcar dropped a plutonium bomb called Fat Man on Nagasaki. The weapon detonated roughly 1,650 feet up, but about 1.5 miles off its intended aiming point, because Nagasaki's hills absorbed much of the blast. Between 60,000 and 80,000 people died by year's end. Between those two bombs, on August 8th, something landed inside Tokyo's leadership that the Peace Party believed carried equal or greater weight. At 11 o'clock that night, Trans-Baikal time, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov told Japanese Ambassador Naoto Sato that the Soviet Union considered itself at war with Japan effective August 9th. Just after midnight, Soviet forces crossed into Manchuria under Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, 89 divisions, 1.5 million men, 3,704 tanks, 1,852 self-propelled guns, 85,819 vehicles, and 3,721 aircraft. They hit a Japanese Guandong army of approximately 700,000 men, and the Guandong Army, Japan's supposed strategic reserve, the force intended to make any Allied invasion of the home islands prohibitively costly, began disintegrating almost immediately. Here is where the conventional account and the academic record part company, and this is the point that most coverage of this story gets wrong. The standard version says the atomic bombs forced Japan's surrender. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, a historian at the University of California, who drew on newly declassified Russian archives alongside American and Japanese records for his 2005 book, Racing the Enemy, published by Harvard's Belknap Press, writes the opposing case directly. I challenge the commonly held view that the atomic bomb provided the immediate and decisive knockout blow to Japan's will to fight. Indeed, the Soviet entry into the war played a greater role than the atomic bombs in inducing Japan to surrender. Hasegawa goes further, concluding that, even without the atomic bombs, the war most likely would have ended shortly after Soviet entry into the war, before November 1st. That is not a fringe position. Richard Frank, in his book, Downfall, places greater weight on the bombs. Ward Wilson argues the Soviet declaration alone was decisive. None of them agree, and the debate remains open. What the orthodox version leaves out is that Japan's surrender came from a deadlocked council that could only be unlocked by the emperor himself, and the factors that moved the emperor were more complicated than any single cause. With the Big Six paralyzed and the country being destroyed from every direction, Prime Minister Suzuki did something with no precedent in modern Japanese history. He called an imperial conference and then asked the emperor to decide. Just before midnight on August 9th, the conference convened in an underground bomb shelter beneath the imperial palace. Joining the Big Six was Privy Council President Baron Kiichiro Hiranuma, and the session ran through the early hours of August 10th. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Suzuki formally put the deadlock to Hirohito and asked him to resolve it. Hirohito sided with the peace party. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration on one condition: preservation of the imperial system. What participants recorded of his statement included these words: "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. The time has come to bear the unbearable." Japan's conditional acceptance went out through Switzerland and Sweden. The Allied reply arrived on August 12th, drafted primarily by U.S. Secretary of State James Burns, and the wording reignited everything. It stated the Emperor's authority would be subject to the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, and the hardliners immediately tore into those two words. Whether subject to meant the Emperor was being placed under an Allied general, or whether it meant the end of the imperial system in practice, even if the institution survived in name, became the new center of the argument. The debate cracked open again. War Minister Anami's position had not moved. From earlier that period, his recorded words were plain. "Japan is not losing the war, since we have not lost any homeland territory. I object to conducting negotiations on the assumption that we are defeated." That was still where Anami stood. But something in Anami was shifting in a way the historical record only catches in fragments. Without his signature, no cabinet decision carried legal weight. Without his active support, no coup could claim legitimate authority. Anami was the most powerful military figure in the cabinet aside from the emperor himself, and privately, the evidence suggests, he understood the war was lost, while refusing to say so publicly. A second imperial conference convened on August 14th, and Hirohito intervened again, confirming Japan's acceptance. Historians refer to this as the Second Sacred Decision, Doseiden. By 7 o'clock that evening, the surrender rescript had been drafted and finalized. Every cabinet member signed it. Anami signed it too. And that's when a four-man NHK recording crew arrived at a different part of the imperial complex with gramophone equipment. The Emperor's address, the dual voice broadcast, could not go out live. The palace had no direct broadcast capacity. Two separate Denon recording rigs were set up as redundant systems, and the technical team cut multiple discs across two sessions that evening, because the Emperor's address ran 4 minutes and 45 seconds, longer than a single 10-inch disc could hold. The finished records were labeled original and copy. Both sets needed to survive the night. They almost didn't. Before the coup, before the forged orders, before the murder, there is Korechika Anami, and what his last night tells us about the entire event. Born February 21, 1887, Anami had given his entire adult life to the Imperial Japanese Army, reaching the position of War Minister by 1945, at 58 years old. He was also the brother-in-law of Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takeshita, one of the men who would lead the coup attempt that very night. The conspirators had approached Anami 2 days earlier. On the night of August 12th, Hatanaka, Takeshita, and others had come to Anami directly, urging him to prevent acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. No commitment came from him. He neither endorsed the coup nor moved to crush it. After signing the surrender rescript on the evening of August 14th, Anami returned to his official residence, and Takeshita came to him there. Sake was shared between the two men. Whatever passed in that conversation, and Takeshita's post-war accounts are the primary source historians have for this period, Anami gave the conspirators nothing they needed: no authorization, no cooperation, no cover. In the early hours of August 15th, Korechika Anami committed seppuku. His death poem read, "Believing firmly that our sacred land shall never perish, I, with my death, humbly apologized to the emperor for the great crime. Those last 3 words have generated debate ever since, whether Anami was apologizing for losing the war, for signing the surrender document, for failing to stop the coup, or for failing to support it remains unanswered in the documentary record. Takeshita was present, because Anami's wounds were not immediately fatal, and accounts differ on how and when death came. Some describe Takeshita performing the ritual second blow, while others placed the time of death closer to 7:30 in the morning, following medical intervention. The ambiguity has never been resolved. What is unambiguous is this: Anami's refusal to endorse the conspirators, combined with his refusal to stop them, created the exact conditions for what happened next. A dozen or fewer officers drove the conspiracy at its core, and at the center of that core was Major Kenji Hatanaka, born March 28, 1912, in Kyoto Prefecture, working in the military affairs section of the War Ministry, 33 years old, and possessed, by every historical account, of total conviction and near-zero strategic judgment. Around Hatanaka stood Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shiozaki, his closest collaborator, Lieutenant Colonel Masataka Ida, Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takeshita, Anami's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Masao Inaba, Colonel Okakatsuerao, Chief of the Military Affairs Section, and Captain Shigetaro Uehara of the Air Academy. Operating separately in Yokohama, as a parallel arm of the same conspiracy, Captain Takeo Sasaki had his own group. Their target was Prime Minister Suzuki. The entire plan rested on one requirement: General Takashi Mori, commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division, had to cooperate. The Imperial Guards controlled access to the palace compound, and without Mori's authority, the rebels couldn't direct the guards, couldn't seal the palace, couldn't conduct a search. Hatanaka went to Mori. Mori refused. After approximately 1 o'clock in the morning of August 15th, Major Kenji Hatanaka shot General Takashi Mori dead, and Captain Shigetaro Uehara killed Mori's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Michinori Shiraishi, who had been present in the room. Those were the only 2 murders committed that night. Here is what was happening simultaneously outside the palace walls. In Yokohama, Captain Sasaki's group arrived at Prime Minister Suzuki's official residence and office, but Chief Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakamiza had received advance word, and Suzuki escaped minutes before the raiders got there. Both buildings were burned. The conspirators also attacked the home of Privy Council President Kichiro Hiranuma, who also escaped. The fires in Yokohama were visible from Tokyo. Back inside the palace complex, Hatanaka moved fast after Mori's death. Using the dead general's official stamp, Hatanaka forged a document the rebels called Imperial Guards Division Strategic Order No. 584, ordering occupation of the palace and Imperial Household Ministry, and framing everything as protection of the emperor. That order went out to guard units throughout the complex, and multiple battalions of the 2nd Regiment of the 1st Imperial Guards began moving into position. Palace police were disarmed. Every entrance to the compound was blocked. Nearly all telephone lines were cut. 18 people were detained, Imperial household, ministry staff and NHK workers, who had come to make the recording. And then the search for the discs began. The gramophone discs were the whole point of the operation. Destroy the recordings and the noon broadcast couldn't happen. Delay the broadcast and the formal surrender announcement got pushed back. Push it back far enough and, in Hatanaka's reasoning, the army in the field would keep fighting, the population would resist, and the emperor might be pressured to reconsider. Every link in that chain had to hold. Almost none of them did. Sometime around 11 o'clock on the night of August 14th, the NHK recording crew had finished. The official originals and the backup copies were placed in the custody of Imperial household staff, and a chamberlain named Yoshihiro Tokugawa took charge of them. When the rebels arrived and began their search, Tokugawa hid the discs, and when Hatanaka confronted him directly at what historical accounts describe as sore point, Tokugawa lied about where they were. The palace compound itself worked against the searchers. The archaic layout of the imperial household ministry meant nothing to military officers who had never served inside a palace. Room names were unfamiliar, stairwells were dark under the wartime blackout, and the corridors ran in directions that made no tactical sense. The search continued for hours without finding anything. One account places the original recording inside a lacquer box, and the backup copy among ordinary documents. Some popular histories describe the discs being smuggled out in a laundry basket of women's underwear. That detail appears in widely read sources, but its sourcing is loose enough that it belongs in the category of popular lore rather than confirmed fact. What is confirmed is that Tokugawa hid the recordings, lied to protect them under direct threat, and the rebels never laid hands on them. Meanwhile, 18 detained prisoners remained in custody throughout the night. Privy Seal Koichi Kido, the emperor's closest personal advisor and a primary target of the conspiracy, had not been captured. Kido and imperial household minister Sotaro Ishiwata spent the night in an underground space described in some accounts as resembling a bank vault beneath the ministry building. By around 3 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Ida delivered the news to Hatanaka that was already becoming unavoidable. The Eastern District Army was mobilizing against them. General Shizuchi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army and the military authority responsible for the defense of the Tokyo region, had refused to join the coup from the start, and now he was moving to end it. Rather than withdraw, Hatanaka tried something that reads, in retrospect, as desperate to the point of bizarre. He contacted the Eastern Army's Chief of Staff, Tatsuhiko Takashima, and requested 10 minutes of airtime on NHK radio, wanting to address the nation before the emperor's broadcast aired. Takashima refused. Hatanaka drove to NHK himself, arriving at the broadcasting studios with a pistol. He confronted the staff and demanded to go on air. NHK announcer Morio Tatino refused him. No shots were fired. Hatanaka left without getting near a microphone. Dawn came. General Shizuchi Tanaka entered the palace complex, and what followed was not a military confrontation. No shots were exchanged between rebel and loyalist forces inside the palace that night. Tanaka spoke directly to the officers commanding the rebel guard units, reportedly berating them for acting against the spirit of the Imperial Japanese Army and against the emperor's declared wishes, then ordering them back to barracks. They went. The conspiracy that had seized the Tokyo Imperial Palace, murdered a division commander, forged an imperial military order, detained 18 people, burned the prime minister's residence, and searched the palace complex for hours ended not in gunfire, but in a conversation at dawn. By approximately 8 o'clock in the morning of August 15, 1945, the Kyujo incident was over. What organizational theorists call authority without legitimacy describes the rebels' position precisely, a distinction military strategists and governance scholars now treat as foundational. Physical control of the palace grounds for several hours meant nothing without a single senior commander's genuine endorsement, because without that endorsement, there was no pathway from tactical possession to strategic effect. Crisis management literature identifies this pattern consistently. Groups that seize physical assets without securing the consent of legitimate authority chains almost always fail to achieve their objectives, regardless of their commitment. The Kyujo incident wasn't a close call in the structural sense. It was a plan that could not succeed, playing itself out on schedule. Around 11 o'clock in the morning of August 15, 1945, Major Kenji Hatanaka walked into the plaza in front of the Imperial Palace, and Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shiozaki walked with him. Hatanaka put his pistol to his own forehead and fired. Shiozaki stabbed himself with a dagger, then shot himself. Found in Hatanaka's pocket was a death poem. I have nothing to regret now that the dark clouds have disappeared from the reign of the emperor. Hatanaka had spent the entire night trying to prevent the emperor's voice from reaching Japan. His last written words honored the emperor's reign. 1 hour later, at noon on August 15, 1945, the Jewel Voice broadcast aired on NHK. Hirohito's recorded voice reached radio sets across the country, the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor speak. Delivered in formal classical Japanese, a register so archaic that many listeners couldn't parse the words as they heard them, the address ran 4 minutes and 45 seconds, translating to 652 words in English. The word for surrender was never spoken. Hirohito referenced, enduring the unendurable, and described a new and most cruel bomb. An NHK announcer clarified afterward what the message meant. Japan had surrendered. The deaths didn't stop with Hatanaka and Shiozaki. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, credited as the founding architect of the kamikaze program, committed seppuku on August 16, declining the ritual second strike and suffering for approximately 15 hours before dying. His final note apologized to the roughly 4,000 kamikaze pilots he had sent to their deaths. General Shizuchi Tanaka, praised afterward as the hero of the August 15 incident, shot himself through the heart at his Tokyo office on August 24. His desk was covered in sutras and a scroll bearing Hirohito's words to him after the incident. Tanaka felt personally responsible for the destruction of Tokyo under the bombing campaign he had overseen as Eastern District Commander. Across Japan, as the noon broadcast played, the response the conspirators had counted on never materialized. Post-war oral histories and journalistic accounts describe crowds gathering around radios in train stations, factories, and town squares, many weeping not with rage but with exhaustion. The propaganda apparatus had spent years conditioning the population to die. Instead, through a gramophone disc hidden in a palace the night before, their emperor told them to live. To understand what actually happened on August 14th and 15th, the people worth examining most closely are not the coup plotters. They are the individuals whose choices stopped the coup from succeeding. Chamberlain Yoshihiro Tokugawa held no weapon, no military rank, and no authority beyond his role as a palace official. When Hatanaka confronted him directly under threat, Tokugawa lied about where the recordings were. Whether the rebels would kill him for the lie, he didn't know. He lied anyway. Tokugawa lived until 1996. NHK announcer Mario Tatino was working in the studio when Hatanaka arrived with a pistol and demanded airtime. The specifics of that confrontation, exactly what was said, who else was present, are not fully documented. What is documented is that Hatanaka walked out without getting near a microphone, and Tatino was still there when he left. 68 years old in August 1945, General Shizuchi Tanaka had already refused the conspirators when they offered him leadership of the coup. At dawn, he drove into the palace complex and spoke to the rebel officers directly, without any shots being fired on either side. 10 days later, Tanaka was dead by his own hand. And then, there is War Minister Korechika Anami, whose role in stopping the coup was paradoxical and total. Anami's refusal to actively back the conspirators was the event that determined the coup's fate before it began. Had the war minister thrown his genuine authority behind Hatanaka, the entire dynamic inside the palace that night would have looked different. A written accord signed by the army's most senior officers on August 14th, committing the army to act in accordance with the emperor's decision, served as a structural barrier that no junior officer could breach without a general's authorization. Anami signed that accord, then signed the surrender rescript, then went home and died. The Jewel Voice broadcast, Gyokyu Hoso, was not delivered live. Every radio in Japan carried the sound from the gramophone discs that Chamberlain Tokugawa had hidden and protected through 6 hours of rebel searching. After August 15th, the original discs were recovered and reportedly never played again. An NHK engineer preserved the copy that became the source of all subsequent recordings, and in June 2015, 70 years after the broadcast, the Imperial Household Agency released a digitally restored version of the original. The formal surrender came on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. For Japan, the documents were signed by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, the same Umezu who had been one of the 3 hardliners in the Big Six who had voted against surrender, and who had ultimately signed the accord committing the army to the emperor's decision. August 24th brought the Matsue incident. Approximately 40 dissident officers and soldiers attacked facilities in Shirmane Prefecture in a final act of resistance. It was suppressed without major consequence. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan on August 30th, and the Allied occupation began. The events of August 14th and 15th, 1945, have never stopped being contested. Herbert Bix, whose 2000 biography of Hirohito won the Pulitzer Prize, argues the emperor bore the largest share of responsibility for the war, not a passive figurehead overruled by generals, but an active participant in policy decisions whose post-war portrayal as a reluctant peaceable ruler was a construction of the Allied occupation. John Dower, in Embracing Defeat, argues that MacArthur's headquarters actively managed the historical record surrounding Hirohito, shaping his presentation to the Allied public and the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in order to preserve the imperial institution as a tool of occupation governance. Those arguments are not settled by the coup story. They sit alongside it, complicating any clean narrative about what really happened and why. The coup mattered because the alternative to surrender was real, specific, and enormous in scale. Japan's plan for defending the home islands against Allied invasion carried the name Ketsugo, organized under a directive issued April 8, 1945. By late summer, approximately 900,000 Japanese troops had been concentrated on Kyushu alone, 65 divisions, though weapons and equipment existed for only 30 to 40 of them. Japanese military planners intended to commit thousands of kamikaze aircraft against the Allied invasion fleet, with estimates of available aircraft running as high as 10,000 or more. The Allied invasion plan was called Operation Downfall, built in 2 phases, Operation Olympic, targeting Kyushu and scheduled for November 1, 1945, followed by Operation Coronet, targeting the Tokyo Plain in the spring of 1946. A Joint Chiefs of Staff analysis from April 1945 estimated Allied casualties from Olympic alone at approximately 456,000. Wider projections put combined Allied casualties across both phases into the millions. Japanese military and civilian deaths in a full invasion scenario were projected in some studies at 5 to 10 million people. Before the first landing craft hit a Japanese beach, the United States manufactured approximately 500,000 Purple Heart medals, the decoration awarded to service members wounded or killed in action. 80 years later, the United States military is still distributing Purple Hearts from that original production run. That number tells you, without ambiguity, what American planners expected to happen. The surrender of August 15, 1945 prevented that invasion. The coup of August 14th and 15th tried to prevent the surrender. That is the chain, and what Kenji Hatanaka and the men around him were trying to do was not, in any abstract sense, to defend national honor. They were trying to ensure that a sequence of events that would have killed potentially millions of people on both sides actually happened. Behavioral researchers have documented the psychological pattern that drove the Kyujo conspirators in high-stakes organizational settings. Sunk cost entrenchment describes the phenomenon where individuals who have invested years, identity, and moral framework in a cause become unable to process information that negates the cause, even when that information is direct and overwhelming. Japan's military establishment had spent decades building an ideology in which death in service to the emperor was the highest possible action, and surrender was not strategically inadvisable, but conceptually impossible. Hatanaka and the conspirators weren't irrational by the internal logic of the system that had shaped them. They were the system's most faithful products, and the system was wrong. August 14th and 15th, 1945 have been adapted into major Japanese films twice, and the gap between the two productions reflects how Japan's relationship with the memory of the war has shifted across decades. The first film, Japan's Longest Day, Nihon no Ichiban no Dai, arrived on August 12, 1967, directed by Kahachi Okamoto from a screenplay by Shinobu Hashimoto, with Toshiro Mifune in the role of War Minister Anami. Running 157 minutes, it became the second highest-grossing Japanese film of 1967 and remains the foundational cinematic treatment of the Kyujo incident. The remake under the same English title came out on August 8, 2015, directed by Masato Harada, casting Koji Yakusho as Anami and Tori Matsuzaka as Hatanaka, timed to the 70th anniversary of the surrender. Behind both films, and behind modern historical understanding of these events, stands a shelf of foundational scholarship. Robert Budos, Japan's Decision to Surrender, published in 1954. The Pacific War Research Societies. Japan's Longest Day, in Japanese in 1965 and English in 1968. John Tollins. The Rising Sun, 1970. Richard Franks. Downfall, 1999. Herbert Bix's Pulitzer-winning Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, 2000. And Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's Racing the Enemy, 2005. The study that most directly challenged the atomic bombasticizer's narrative by incorporating Russian archival sources that no previous English-language work had fully used. Pull back from the drama, the murder in the palace, the hidden discs, the dawn confrontation, and look at what the Kyujo incident reveals about how systems fail and how they hold. The conspiracy collapsed for structural reasons, not by luck. A written accord signed by Japan's most senior army commanders on August 14, committing the army to the emperor's decision, acted as a firebreak that no junior officer could cross without a general's authorization. No general joined Hatanaka. Every senior officer the conspirators approached refused. And because the surrender decision had come from the emperor himself, not from politicians or civilian administrators, opposing it required the rebels to defy the very institution they claimed to be protecting. That internal contradiction made the conspiracy's failure inevitable from the moment Hatanaka moved without Anami's backing. But here is the part of this story that gets less attention than the night's drama deserves. 3 of the acts that preserved the surrender, Tokugawa concealing the recording, Tateno refusing airtime, Tanaka confronting the rebels at dawn, were not performed by powerful people exercising institutional authority. A chamberlain lied at sore point. A radio announcer said no to a man with a pistol. A general drove to a palace with his rank and his voice, and no backup plan. None of those 3 people had a clean outcome guaranteed when they made their choice. The formal machinery of surrender, the emperor's 2 decisions, the cabinet signatures, the rescript, was real and legally irreversible before the coup began. But the machinery ran through individual people, in the dark, under threat. The largest single event of August 14th and 15th, 1945, was protected in its final hours by people who simply refused to move. No treatment of these events is complete without addressing the most contested dimension of the entire story: what role Emperor Hirohito actually played, and what that role means for his responsibility for the war itself. The dominant post-war narrative, built in part by an Allied occupation that had strategic reasons to protect the imperial institution, presented Hirohito as a constitutional monarch of limited real power who ended the war by overriding his militarist advisors. Herbert Bix's biography, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2000, challenges this directly, arguing that the historical record shows Hirohito as an active participant in wartime policy, present, informed, and involved, rather than a passive figure overruled by generals. John Dowers, Embracing Defeat, takes a different angle, arguing that MacArthur's headquarters actively shaped how Hirohito was presented to the Allied public and to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, engineering a portrait of imperial innocence to preserve the institution as a stabilizing force during occupation. Whether that was wise occupation policy is a separate question from what Hirohito actually did between 1931 and 1945. Serious historians have spent decades on these questions and reached different conclusions. Hirohito's two sacred decisions in August 1945 were genuinely unprecedented interventions that broke a structural deadlock and ended the war. Whether those acts in August 1945 alter the moral weight of what preceded them is a question Japanese historians and Japanese society have carried for 80 years without resolution. At noon on August 15, 1945, a needle touched a gramophone disc in the NHK broadcasting studio in Tokyo. A disc cut the previous night in an underground bunker, hidden in a palace by a chamberlain who lied at sore point to protect it, surviving 6 hours of searching by officers willing to commit treason and murder to destroy it. The voice on that disc was the first time most people in Japan had ever heard their emperor speak. The war was over. This debate carries enough weight to deserve a full treatment, because it sits underneath everything else in this story. The version taught in most American history courses runs as follows. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, Japan surrendered, the bombs caused the surrender, and the bombs saved lives by preventing an invasion that would have killed more people than the bombs did. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa does not argue the atomic bombs were irrelevant. What Hasegawa argues, using original Japanese, American, and newly available Soviet documents, is that the causal chain is more complicated than that version allows. Japan's leadership had processed Hiroshima as catastrophic, but had not concluded it required immediate surrender. What broke the internal debate, in Hasegawa's reading of the documents, was the Soviet declaration of war, because Soviet entry eliminated the last remaining diplomatic option, Soviet mediation, and destroyed the Guandong army that was meant to make Allied invasion prohibitively costly. Richard Frank, working from different archival emphasis, holds that the bombs were decisive. Sadao Asada, a Japanese historian, also emphasizes the bombs as the primary cause, pointing out that Japanese military leaders themselves cited them as the reason in immediate post-war statements made before they had reason to understand the political utility of citing the bombs rather than the Soviet invasion. Ward Wilson argues the Soviet entry alone was decisive, and that the bombs were framed as the decisive cause primarily for American political reasons, to justify their use, and to claim credit for ending the war. The disagreement is not academic in the trivial sense. It bears on how nations justify weapons of mass destruction, how the memory of the Pacific War is constructed in different countries, and what lessons get drawn from the war's end for contemporary nuclear strategy. What no serious historian disputes, Japan's surrender in August 1945 was not a simple outcome. 2 atomic bombs, Soviet entry, and 2.5 months of firebombing all hit an internal structure that could only be unlocked by an unprecedented act of imperial intervention. Remove any one element, and the timeline changes. The counterfactual cannot be resolved, and anyone who tells you it can is not reading the same documents the historians are. September 2, 1945. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yashijiro Yumiza signed Japan's formal instruments of surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Yumizu, one of the three hardliners in the Big Six, a man who had voted against surrender, put his signature on the document that formally ended the war. By that date, the principal figures of this story were already accounted for. Korechika Anami was dead, seppuku in the early hours of August 15th. His blood-stained uniform, his sword, and his final note are on display at the Yashukan Museum beside Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. I humbly apologize to the Emperor for the great crime. Those words remain unexplained in the documentary record. Kinji Hatanaka was dead, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the forehead, approximately 11 in the morning of August 15th, in the plaza in front of the Imperial Palace. He was 33 years old. Jiro Shiozaki was dead, dagger and pistol, same plaza, same hour. Shizuchi Tanaka was dead, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the heart on August 24th, at his Tokyo office, 10 days after the broadcast he had protected. Takajiro Onishi was dead, seppuku on August 16th, after 15 hours of suffering. The kamikaze program he had built to extend the war outlived his capacity to continue it. Yoshihiro Tokugawa, the chamberlain, who had lied at sore point to hide the recording, lived until 1996, long enough to see the Cold War end, the Japanese economic miracle rise, and the bubble collapse, and a digital age that would eventually restore the recording he protected to sharper sound than it had when it was first played. On the night of August 14, 1945, Tokugawa had been in the underground recording room where the broadcast was made. He survived everything that came after. The gramophone discs he protected were played once. The war they ended never came back. The standard framing of the Kyujo incident is that a small group of fanatical officers nearly prevented Japan's surrender. That framing is accurate, and it misses the deeper point. The margin between catastrophe and resolution wasn't determined by the coup's strategic viability. It was determined by choices made by specific individuals in specific moments. The wrong choice by any one of them could have produced consequences that extended far beyond that single night. Chamberlain Tokugawa was one person hiding one set of discs. Announcer Tatino was one person refusing one demand. General Tanaka was one officer driving to a palace at dawn without knowing what he would find when he got there. None of those three knew how their choice would turn out when they made it. The formal machinery of surrender was legally irreversible before the coup began. The emperor had spoken. The cabinet had signed. The rescript existed. But none of that machinery implemented itself. It ran through individuals, in the dark, at sore point, with a gun in the room. Institutions don't hold themselves. They are held by the people inside them who, at the moment it matters, choose to hold them. The war ended because enough of those people did. Major Kinji Hatanaka spent the last night of his life trying to prevent the emperor's voice from reaching the Japanese people. His death poem, found in his pocket after he shot himself in the plaza, honored the emperor's reign. The emperor's broadcast played at noon. Tokugawa's hidden discs made it possible. And thanks to a chamberlain who chose to lie rather than hand them over, nobody ever had to find out what Japan's history looked like without that broadcast.